Hi, I'm Baggy. I got on my bikini and we're going to talk about a movie that's been on my mind. Today we're going to talk about The Howling that came out in 1981, directed by Joe Dante, who also did Gremlins. And a lot of people don't know this, but Joe Dante and John Landis, who did American Werewolf in London, are very good friends. And they had very similar people working for them. But the main difference, I think, was that Tom Savini worked for Joe Dante and um oh shoot Rick Baker, that's his name, sorry. Rick Baker worked for John Landis. But I think there was a bit of collaboration between the two. They're both probably the best werewolf movies that we have. And I think the main difference between them is that in American Werewolf in London, the transformation is like very painful appearing, but in The Howling, it seems like the transformation is almost like orgasmic in a way because they seem like they're enjoying themselves instead of being like, oh, help me, like they do, like the main character does in American Werewolf in London. And this movie has many sequels, which I don't think Joe Dante did any of the sequels. I think that was like out of his hands. But the I haven't seen any of the sequels. I heard they're like hot garbage. So I've never seen them. But I love The Howling. I even watch it with my daughter, which sounds like a little weird because she's 4 years old. But really, the only times I have to cover her eyes are in the beginning when the main character is in a adult shop and the scene where Bill and Marcy hook up. So really, I only had to cover her eyes twice during the whole thing. But the movie starts out with like, the typical screen with the title, and it like kind of breaks apart into little pieces of glass. And I think this was the first movie to like have a title that did that, which I thought was pretty interesting. And then, we're in New York, um, and Dee Wallace is in this, who I think is a real scream queen. Sorry, Jamie Lee Curtis, but I love Dee Wallace. I absolutely adore her. And she is a news anchor, and she is basically told that she is to try to lure the serial killer into this adult shop that she goes into so they can try to catch him. So she's kind of like in this sting operation. And she talks with her coworkers on the payphone, like, hey, I'm about to go in, call the police, have the police come, make sure I don't get hurt type stuff. And then she goes into the shop. Everybody in the shop kind of leaves because they see her and they're like, what's she doing here? And I think they assume she's like a cop or something, and they take off. And she goes to the back room where you can watch movies. And she goes and has a seat. And as she's watching the movie, the serial killer that they are trying to capture, Eddie Quist, comes up behind her and says, all this like raunchy stuff to her. He says, I'm gonna light you up like a Christmas tree and I wanna show you something. And she screams for help. The police come, they fire shots, but they take the body of Eddie to the morgue because they think he's dead. And they ask her what happened, and she can't remember. It's like she was so afraid, her mind to protect her blanked it out, and she had amnesia. So she goes to work the next day to talk about it, and she freezes and seems very upset. So they decide that she needs to see a counselor. She goes and sees Dr. Wagner and basically is like, am I crazy? He's like, oh yeah, you're bananas, joking around with her. And he's like, no, I think you would really benefit from staying at the colony. And she's like, oh, is that your place? And he's like, yeah, it's a nice little retreat. Only special people go there. So her and her husband, Bill, make the drive out there to go. And she doesn't really want to go, but Bill's like, oh no, it'll be good for you. What's the worst that could happen? And her friends from work, Christopher and Terry, who are also a couple, go into Eddie Quist's old apartment and decide to like snoop around. And we get a really good jump scare where this golden retriever like jumps in the window, which is funny because like I've never seen a golden retriever look vicious like that before. Um, So that's probably like the first jump scare we really get. And they're looking through Eddie's stuff and they find all these drawings. They find a drawing of um, Karen, which is Dee's character, the main character. They find a bunch of drawings of wolves. They find a landscape looking drawing, and they're like, "Is this a real place?" And there's some significance to that. And they go and ask Dr. Wagner about that, and he's like, "Oh, I don't know," but he says that he's a right-minded individual, so he uses the right side of his brain, and that makes him creative, but it also can make him kind of dangerous. Which is baloney. Like, Dr. Wagner knows where that picture's from. He just doesn't want to explain it. And Karen and her husband Bill, they get to the colony. They're having like a little cookout. And Bill's a vegetarian. He doesn't eat meat. And they're like cooking some meat on like a spigot over a fire. And he's like, "Oh no, I don't eat meat. No, thank you." And there's music playing and everyone's like introducing themselves. And then Bill and Karen separate for a little bit to get to know people. And he goes to get some punch and he meets Marcy, who is very, very attractive. She is like, he's like, "Well, what is the punch?" And she's like, "It's good, drink it." And he's like, "I'm looking for my wife." And she's like, "Why?" Which I thought was kind of funny. And, during that time, Bill kind of looks at her and he walks away. And then we hear Karen talking with one of the other women at the colony, and she says, "Oh, she's a nymphomaniac. And which is funny because Dr. Wagner speaks up and he's like, "No, Marcy just has that earthy energy about her. She can't help it." And, kind of like defending her in a way. And we also meet Marcy's brother, who looks like a total creep. He looks super weird. And while they're at the cookout, Marcy approaches Dr. Wagner and gives him a book and says, "I don't want my brother reading this anymore. You've done enough damage." And we don't really catch what the book is, but apparently it was making him change his ways or something, and she didn't appreciate that. And then the older gentleman at the party tries to commit suicide by jumping off the cliff, and everyone stops him, and he's like, "Oh, it's just the same thing over and over again." And they're like, "Oh, don't be silly. And they're like, "Oh, he's just drunk. Like, don't mind him." And they go back to their cabin for the night, and Karen hears a wolf howling, and she gets really scared. And Bill's like, "We're in the country now, honey. Like, it's normal." And she's like, "Yeah, I know, but that was really close. And he's like, "We're fine. We're out in the country now." And while they're at the colony, uh, their friends Terry and Christopher are looking into the serial killer, and they go to a shop which has a bunch of books about werewolves, and they get a book called Werewolves, Demons, and Magic. And he also has like silver bullets and stuff. And he's talking about how if you don't burn werewolves or shoot them with these, they can always come back. It's funny because he says they're worse than cockroaches, which is really funny. And, Karen's doing like group therapy at the colony, trying to, explain what happened, but she can't remember. She can't remember what she saw, like I said, because her brain's trying to protect her. And there's also a scene where she's playing tennis with one of the girls at the colony, and they go to pick up the balls, and the sheriff is there, and he says, "Oh, you girls need a good retriever, huh?" And he's like, "Oh, yeah, don't be worried. It's probably just a coyote. We're going to check it out." And all the men get together and decide to go on a hunting party to look for it. And Bill joins Bill joins their group. He's like, "I've never been hunting before." And I guess he ends up shooting a rabbit, which they were all like impressed with because he said he'd never been hunting before. And the group kind of clears out, and Bill is planning on going back to his cabin with his wife, or to go see his wife. And Marcy's brother stops him and says, "Oh, that's a good rabbit. And he's like, "Yeah, I don't eat meat, so I don't know what to do with it." He's like, "Oh, that's a sin to kill something and not eat it." He's like, "Take it over to my sister's cabin. She'll cook it for you." And he's like, "Are you sure?" And he's like, "Yeah, she'd love it. So he goes over to her cabin. gives her the rabbit. She's not saying a whole lot. And he's like, so are you going to cook it? She's like, I'll cook it later. And then she starts to like make a move on him. And he's like, you know, I can't be here. Like, I'm leaving. And he goes on his way back from there. He does get attacked by a werewolf. And we don't know if it is Marcy's brother that attacked him or if it was Marcy herself that attacked him. We're not really sure who as a werewolf attacked him, but they did. And he gets like a horrible bite, you know, has a bunch of scratches, and, you know, he goes home to his wife about it, and she's very upset, and she calls her friends Christopher and Terry, and she says that, you know, he just got bit by a wolf, which is funny because they're both in bed watching the classic black and white film The Wolf Man. And in the movie that they're watching, it's talking about how they become a wolf at the full moon. And it's like there's a whole lot of like hints as to what's going on, but they're like, no, that can't be it. And they're like, oh, we'll be right down. But Terry goes without her husband because he said he has to talk to their boss while she goes. So she goes by herself. And on her way there, in the meantime, you know, Bill and his wife Karen get into a big fight about Marcy because she knows Marcy is into him. And, you know, she's real, and it's funny because, you know, he was like really trying to be intimate with her, and she's like, oh, you know, I'm not ready because of what happened with Eddie Quist. And now she's like, come on, let's be intimate. And he's like, it must be the medicine from where I got bit. I'm just not in the mood. And, you know, Karen's like, wow, we really are out of sync, you know. And she's starting to kind of tell this relationship might not be working out. Like, she might leave the colony at the very least without Bill because things just aren't working. And, you know, it's just kind of funny because she says, oh, we're so out of sync, which makes a lot of sense because, you know, Bill's got bitten by a werewolf at this point. But, you know, he doesn't say that. He just says he was bit by a wolf, which is kind of funny. You think he would know the difference. And then that night he goes outside because he can't sleep because he's starting to feel the changes inside of him. And there's a bonfire with Marcy by it, and they end up hooking up. And as they're hooking up, they both kind of turn into werewolves. And then after that, he is back in his cabin with his wife Karen, and he has a little patch right here, which is hiding. I guess they get like a tattoo on them of a wolf whenever they turn into one. So he's obviously got that hidden. And he changes his shirt, and she's like, oh, what are those scratches from? He's like, oh, it's from the wolf bite. She's like, those weren't there the other night. And he kind of snaps at her. And she makes a comment about how Marcy's been trying to hook up with him this whole time, and he slaps her. And then, you know, she's pretty done with him at that point, and he leaves. And she is super upset. She's thinking about leaving. She's packing her bags, and as she does that, Terry arrives, and Terry is like looking for her cabin, and she's almost to Karen's cabin, and she hears Bill's voice say, Tracy, come here. So, you know, she does, and she ends up going into Marcy's cabin. And as she's looking in the cabin, it's interesting because she sees a hand-drawn picture of Marcy, which was obviously done by Eddie as well. And she also sees like a smiley face sticker on the door, which is something that was present when Eddie almost killed Karen at the beginning. There was a smiley face sticker on the jukebox. So it's kind of funny. That's like a little hint that we're about to see a werewolf, or someone's about to be attacked by a werewolf. And, you know, in through the door comes this huge werewolf creature. And it's funny because before that we see like its hand reaching at her, and then we see its legs walking. So it's almost like, you know, it's almost like a fairy tale. It's like, oh, what big hands you have, what big feet you have. And then we see the whole thing try to attack her. And, excuse me. And she does end up cutting the werewolf's arm off and, you know, escapes. And she goes to the main office where she believes that the doctor will be to talk to him about it. Terry does. And it's funny because we see the hand that she cut off start to turn back to human as she has left to go pursue to find the doctor in his office. and she's looking for the doctor in his office. He's not there. So she gets on the phone, she calls Christopher and says, something's really wrong, something's going on. And as she's talking to him on the phone, he's watching a cartoon of like Disney's The Big Bad Wolf, which I thought was ironic as well. And he's like, look in the filing cabinet, see if there's any files in there about Eddie. And as she's going through the filing cabinet, we see a huge hand reach in front of her and pull the file out. And we look, and it is an enormous werewolf that is towering over her with giant ears and, a big snout and huge teeth. It's it's a very good rendition of a werewolf. It looks really great. And, she tries to get away, but she doesn't. She's ultimately strangled by it, which I thought was kind of strange that it strangled her instead of just ripping her apart. But whatever, that's fine. And, the boyfriend, Christopher, knows something's wrong. So he gets in the car. He goes to the shop they were looking at, takes the silver bullets, which is funny because the manager is like, I don't know what those are priced yet. I have to call a jeweler. And he's like, bill me, and runs out with them. And he starts making the trip to the colony. And unfortunately, he will not get there in time to save Terry. She is killed pretty quickly after they're disconnected from their phone call. And he calls the sheriff department, and they're like, oh, don't worry, I'm sure she's fine. And as that's going on, we see Terry kind of taking her last breaths as she is strangled by the werewolf. And we know that the sheriff is in on it. He is also a werewolf, too. And we also, we see Karen then come into the doctor's office because she is trying to find a ride to leave because she assumes Bill has left her for Marcy at this point because she hasn't seen him. And she ends up finding her friend Terry murdered on the ground, and she's super upset about it. And then, in comes Eddie Quist, who isn't in a werewolf form at the moment, but, he is like pulling like a bullet out of his brain. I'm not sure if that was just part of him being shot last time he saw her or what. But oh, I did forget something. Before Terry and Christopher end up, after they look into his apartment, they go visit him at the morgue, Eddie at the morgue, to see if he had that tattoo or not. And the morgue is it's empty. Like, the body's gone. There's a bunch of scratches on the door. So we know that's how Eddie got away from the morgue and got to the colony, as he fled from the morgue. Can't believe I forgot to mention that. Sorry. Anyways, so, Karen is in the office. She finds her dead friend, and then Eddie approaches her and starts to tell her that, he wanted to show her something. He still wants to show her something. And then he begins to transform into a werewolf in front of her. It's a really good transformation. I believe they used, like, these bladders on his face to, like, make it bubble. And so it's a really, really cool transformation scene. I mean, it's right up there with American Werewolf in London, in my opinion. And then after that, Karen is taken by Eddie to the rec center, and the husband, or I don't know if they're married or not, but the boyfriend of Terry, Christopher, comes, and he ends up looking in the same spot that Terry called him from, and he does run into Eddie. He tries to shoot Eddie, but Eddie takes his gun from him. And then he does end up successfully killing Eddie with his silver bullets. He ends up getting in his car and driving to the rec center because that's where Eddie told him that, Karen would be. And at the rec center, they have Terry laid on like a little slab, and they're all kind of in this barn. And the doctor comes in, and Karen's like, oh my God, I'm so happy to see you. And he's basically like, don't be happy to see me. I'm in on this. And we don't really know if he's a werewolf or not. But he does get scratched by Marcy at one point. So if he wasn't already a werewolf, we know he was going to become a werewolf because he was attacked by one of them. And basically, all of the werewolves yell at him and say, like, oh, you said we could live alongside people and we can't. Like, we're doing things our way now. The girl's ours now. Like we're gonna attack her, And then as they're all like they start changing, they're about to attack Karen, Christopher pulls up in the car, points his gun, says, I have silver bullets, and they don't really believe him until he starts shooting, and people actually do start dying because he does have silver bullets to kill them with. And then they end up locking all of the werewolves in the barn and lighting it on fire. And they try to escape, but the sheriff is also a werewolf and he tries to stop them. And they end up blowing him up as well in their car. And then they get in, as they escape their car that's blown up, they go into the sheriff's car. And as they're driving off, you see all the you see three remaining werewolves like trying to get into the car, which I thought was really reminiscent of Cujo, because Dee Wallace is like trapped in this car and all these like furry hands are like reaching around trying to grab her. I thought that was pretty interesting. And they end up escaping, but Karen gets bitten. So we know she's going to turn into a werewolf. And, they go to their job at the news place the next day. And, the plan is she is going to change on camera. That way the whole country believes her that there are werewolves out there. And she does change on camera, and Christopher puts her down. And it's a really sad moment because she doesn't even look like a mean werewolf. Like, she kind of looks like a big puppy. And it's funny, too, because we see people that are watching the news broadcast, and we see a very young Mick Garris saying, "What's that?" And a bunch of kids saying, "Oh my God, what lady turned into a werewolf?" And then it goes to a point at a bar where people are watching. And the one guy says, "Oh, that's just special effects. That's not real." And one guy was like, "Just because I'm shit-faced doesn't mean it didn't happen," which I thought was funny. And then we see another person at the bar who says, "I want a drink," and this young lady would like a hamburger. And then it pans to her and they're like, "How would you like your burger?" And she says, "Rare." And it is Marcy in human form. And the credits roll over, hamburgers being cooked on the grill. And I just love this movie. I think if you want to watch a good werewolf movie, this is, this one or American Werewolf in London are like the only two acceptable ones. Super fun watch. I mean, for coming out in 81, I feel like it still holds up today and is very, very relevant. Oh my gosh, relevant. But anyways, I would give this movie a 4 out of 5 stars just because it is kind of slow at first. But other than that, it's a great movie and I would recommend it to anyone. Again, my name's Baggy and I got on my bikini, and thank you for watching.